play out is, well, what might you expect to take place during the murders if you assume that the murder will take place? Judging from the way Raskolnikov has been talking about the murder, his philosophizing about it, his planning and so on, what might you have expected to happen during the murder? Or another way, I'll say, what did Raskolnikov expect would happen during the murder? Yeah. Okay, yes, so I think those are like the bigger ideas of what might be happening after that, but perhaps on a more practical level, what would be the mechanics might we expect of the murder process itself? Yeah.
I think he thought he'd be like more calculated and not as like planned it out more thoroughly rather than just like it. That's how I like envisioned it all going smoothly, and then it kind of did not go that way.
Yes, it goes completely not as planned. Essentially, he's supposed to be so rational. What's the point of counting 730 steps if when you get there you don't actually sort of check whether the door is open so someone can come in and murder you and things like that, or make sure that you're there at the right time and so on and so forth. So it doesn't go at all according to his sort of rational expectations. And apart from the fact that's interesting on the level of, well, what we make of Raskolnikov and his motivations, it's also, of course, extremely effective as an exciting sort of thriller type thing that we expect to go one way, and all of a sudden it all goes so wrong. Okay, and then and a murder that's not so planned, etc., and then all of the tension around will he escape and how will he escape and so on and so forth. So I think that's there's a huge discrepancy between what we his expectations, his aims, his planning, and the actual consequences of the actual events of the murder. So that's certainly on the level of the narrative is a very important point. Okay, so which bit had we got to? So page 67, 68. So one of the things that had gone wrong originally in the planning was that the axe wasn't readily available, but then as luck would have it, another axe appears on page 68. So he feels that his fortune smiling upon him. What do you think might be the significance of some of his strange musings as he walks past the Yusupov Gardens? He was even getting carried away by the notion of introducing tall fountains there. Came to the conclusion extending the summer garden to the Field of Mars, and even joining into the gardens of Mikhailsky Palace would be a wonderful and most beneficial thing for the city. What does this imply? Why is he having those thoughts at this moment? Did it seem strange to you? He's going on his way to plan a murder, and he started thinking about sort of town planning or something. What does that indicate? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Sort of like a regularity about the action that he's about to commit. And there's also, he might be trying to sort of distract himself or sort of pull himself away from what he's about to do, by sort of focusing himself on something else.
Okay, good. Yeah, that's certainly one possibility. Anything else about the specifics of the things he's thinking about here? Yeah.
I guess this is like more of a question. I just wonder about the significance of like the fountains, like and how they would like freshen up the square versus the dream that he had earlier about like drinking from the cool stream. Like, is that like a recurring theme of like coolness and like water being kind of this like feverish?
Well, yes, I think it would be in the sense that the overall atmosphere is this one of it's of stifling. He can't breathe. It's hot. It's oppressive, and so on. And then, as you say, in the dream sequence, the positive image of having the refreshing drink of some spiritual thirst being sort of slaked and so on, slacked or whatever it is. Yeah, I mean, I think that is there. And maybe, of course, both of these things are trying to combine them into the positive vision, because what he seems to be doing here is almost thinking in terms of Peter the Great. Remember, what did Peter the Great do? He decides he's going to build this great city. This is actually a depiction of how to make Petersburg even better. So that's why I say he's like a town planner. He's an architect. He's trying to build some future sort of happiness or make people's lives better. So this is actually him trying to think, okay, I'm going to do this awful thing, but don't forget why I'm doing it. It's actually to make people's lives better. I've got this utilitarian plan. It's intriguing that Dostoevsky, when he actually sort of talks about this theme of ends and means in his most powerful expression of it in Brothers Karamazov at the end, the image he uses is to be the architect on such conditions. He has Ivan Karamazov saying, if you're going to build if you're going to construct this building of universal harmony, against like the Crystal Palace or any other sort of big utopian project, would you be willing to construct it on the bones of the suffering of or the tears of this one child? Would you agree to be the architect on such principles? Answer me and do not lie. He says that to Alyosha because he believes that both the socialist projects but also God's project essentially are built on all of these victims, and in both cases it's unacceptable, that whole philosophy of ends and means. It gives Ivan Karamazov a bit of a dilemma then, of course, but that's what he seems to say. So I think this notion of building of the architect is very important. Remember, Petersburg was built on bones and suffering and blood and so on. So he's trying to think of the good things that he's going to do when he proves that he's a great man, essentially. And in that sense, I think it is a direct link back to Peter the Great and his construction of St. Petersburg. But I think you're right to suggest that this double positive image is meant, in theory at least, to show what a good guy Raskolnikov is, linking his positive image of spiritual refreshment with these fountains. But the reality, of course, is very different. The next set of liquid images we'll get will be very different from this sort of clear, refreshing water with all of the blood in the pawnbroker's apartment. Okay, so I do think that Petrine scene then is brought in there. But of course, it also undermines somewhat the notion that Petersburg is such a great project, because as in Bronze Horseman, we get the other side of the story. It says, in such a large city, why do we have not just these lovely gardens and fountains, but we have such filth and stench and unpleasantness? So that's the two sides of any project, essentially, and something that Raskolnikov is aware of. His claim in his philosophy is that he's going to try and make these things better. In practice, of course, it's far more complicated. Okay, so this reference, top of page 69, men on the way to the scaffold, clinging to every object they pass. When Dostoevsky recounted what he felt just before he thought he was going to be executed in 1849, it was precisely that, looking at the church spire, seeing there was a bird on it, seeing that the sun was glinting on it, etc., trying to make the most of those last moments of his existence, essentially, even though he said he believed that there would be an afterlife as well. So this combines the Victor Hugo, The Last Day of Condemned Man, very important work for Dostoevsky, with his own personal experiences, of course. I mentioned before that the hay cart helping to shield him from prying eyes might be significant as, again, fate helping him out, and that hay is a symbol of good luck in certain cultures. And everything seems to go absolutely perfectly. He walks up, everything's sort of deserted, he doesn't see anyone. It's a bit like in a horror film when someone says it's quiet, maybe too quiet, essentially. Good Halloween theme. It's precisely that sense of too quiet, this is the calm before the storm. Things are going to go very badly wrong in a moment, but at the moment, at least, it's working out for him. Okay, so the ringing of the bell is it's a pretty terrifying moment. I think in various film versions, or you can certainly imagine it as almost like the ringing of the bell in Silence of the Lambs, when that's a very effective scene at the end. You can imagine something similar happening here. Okay, so then the encounter with the old woman, the second encounter, once again, she's described in pretty unpleasant terms. Maybe we feel more sorry for her on this occasion, because she obviously is quite frightened, and Raskolnikov is more assertive at this moment. And of course, this is prefiguring what's about to happen there. So perhaps for the first time we don't see her just as a villain, but she's something of a victim here as well. She's an old woman, he's a young man. Of course, she doesn't know at that moment he's about to kill her, but it is pretty terrifying nonetheless. At the same time, we're told that he's almost sort of terrified in another half minute of her staring at him, that he would have fled, thinking, why am I doing this? This is not what I am, essentially. Okay, but nonetheless, he's goes according to his plan. He's thought it all out. Give her the false cigarette case and take it from there. Okay, so at the moment, or just before killing her, we're told his arms were terribly weak. As I said before, he's almost on autopilot. He doesn't really know what he wants to do. But once he's got to this point, it's almost as if he has no freedom of will. Can he, at this moment, when he's there, everything as he's planned up to that moment, he's got the axe, the old woman is there, her back to him. Does he actually have any freedom? Could he have stopped at that moment? Well, this is the big question, I suppose, Dostoevsky is asking. Presumably he could have, but something almost seems to take over him, which is not to absolve him of the responsibility, of course, but it's psychologically, it's almost as if there was nothing else he could have done at that point. Okay, so the next depiction of the old woman again is pretty unpleasant. The thickly greased hair, but it's thin hair as well, so it's a strange combination. One hand she was still holding the pledge. The word pledge, of course, is a significant word. One can think back to a famous Pushkin work where he talks about the pledge of immortality. So it's some type of promise, if you like, as well. Whether something's been pledged to us, some type of hope, I think, could be implied here too. the way that she holds up her arms is a bit like the Countess and the Queen of Spades, and of course that theme will be brought out a bit later in the text, and perhaps even more so when Lisaveta is not protecting herself. It's somewhat similar to the rather pathetic attempts of the Countess to hold her hands out against Sir Herman. Do you think there's any significance about the fact that Raskolnikov hits the pawnbroker with the butt of the axe, as opposed to when he kills Lisaveta, he actually uses the blade of the axe? Do you think that's significant, and if so, what might it imply? Had you noticed that, Tito, because it is stressed quite a bit in the text?
I would think that getting hit by the butt of the axe would be a lot more painful, maybe slower kind of death, or like a blunt injury, whereas when he killed Elizaveta, it was more of in like a frenzy, and he didn't know what to do, so he was like, well, I gotta kill her quickly, so he uses the sharp end.
Yeah, it's interesting. Again, I suppose that might be a very personal thing, which is worse, which is more unpleasant. I mean, you may be right that it's a sort of quicker, more brutal, but perhaps in some ways less painful. I mean, I'm sure in both ways it's incredibly painful. So death, rather than being hit a few times with the butt of the axe. I suppose in terms of the visuals of it, the notion of the head almost being sort of cut in two by the blade is more sort of terrifying there. That in some ways you can almost say, well, what's, perhaps it's like hitting her with a wooden stick, or that. It's not actually with an axe because he's using the butt of it. So I think there are two ways of taking it, but I certainly do take your point that in some ways maybe, I mean, certainly symbolically it links more closely with the beating of the horse, that it's like the wooden stick, as it were, rather than the actual axe blade. But it may also, of course, then the fact that there are the two different parts of the weapons sort of show that these are two different murders, the planned one and the unplanned one, and that the fact that if we think of Elizaveta's death as somehow even more so terrible because there's complete disfacement of this so young woman there, it's the thing that Raskolnikov has not considered as part of the consequences of doing evil to do good. Actually, a lot of other evil can follow in its wake as well. But it may simply be for variety, but he's put these differences in too. Okay, good. So he goes into the bedroom after killing her. It's immaculately clean. If I haven't double-checked, and I should have, whether the immaculate here is exactly the same word that's used for Sonia's cleanliness, or having the yellow ticket information that she's sexually healthy and so on. But if that word immaculate is the same thing, then that would be a prefiguring perhaps of there's going to be a Sonia connection more directly, because of course we find out that Lisaveta and Sonia were friends. That in some ways they are similar. Both have elements of this Russian concept of the holy fool about them. I'll talk about that a bit later. Okay, the fact that he thinks that the old woman might still be alive, that could also be a link with Queen of Spades. Remember that the old lady comes alive, or thinks she comes alive, so he has to double check. Probably less likely a connection with Gogol's V, but it could also be there as well. Some of his actions just seem a bit strange, the way he sort of, can't cut the string where the keys are, and he's fiddling with the axe blade. Perhaps he should have brought a knife or scissors or something. It all seems quite a waste of 2 minutes, and done in a rather messy way, getting blood on him and so on. Okay, I think someone mentioned before about the way that Raskolnikov, when he was listening to her before, he was very logically processing what was taking place in the bedroom, that key would open this, that key would open that, and now even though perhaps he has that information somewhere, he keeps on getting it wrong. It's the wrong key, so everything not working out as he planned at that moment. Then things seem to go a bit better. He does find a few things of value among her, in the box and so on, in the trunk. But then he hears this noise outside, which of course is he can't believe that there could be someone there. Surely he would have shut the door behind him. It's not 100% clear, of course, that what he says is, why didn't I shut the door? Elizaveta could have had her own key. I mean, we don't know for certain. I think it would be unlikely that the old woman wouldn't have wanted to shut the door behind him. On the other hand, it all happened so quickly that he just barged in, essentially, that maybe indeed the door had been open all of this time. Lisaveta's, I suppose, of strangeness or inadequacy in some ways, that may be a bit unfair. She's just seen her half-sister battered to death on the floor, but perhaps she should have run, she should have made more of a noise. It just seems that she just doesn't know how to process what's taking place there. There's something so very childlike about her. We're told that she's scared and backing into the corner, essentially. And as was said, Raskolnikov in some type of frenzy, then he sort of panics. Now, it's not clear that he would have had any other options there other than to kill the only witness to his crime. But certainly this is not something that had been part of the calculation. Okay, but now he's sort of killed her. So what are we to make of this? Is it the fact that despite Aliona's sort of terrible nature, there's an implication that Elizabeth was also part of her, that perhaps Aliona is not all evil, that this is her soul, this is a good side if you want to see it as part of this duality within the text. That's one way of looking at it. Or we can separate them out completely and say that in any of these philosophies, however well-meaning they may be, this utilitarian notion of the greatest good to the greatest number, the collateral damage is always going to be there, and it's going to be far more terrible than one can sort of, calculate, one can work out in advance. That's what seems to be implied here. Okay, so he talks about the hopelessness, hideousness, and absurdity, and to understand how many obstacles and perhaps even acts of evil he still had to overcome and commit to get out and get home. So he's already committed one more act of murder than he planned before, so how many more might be there? Remember when the people come to the staircase, he's actually wondering what he would do with them. Would he have to fight his way out and practice? Would he kill them as well? So the one murder might become far more than one murder. Okay, he sort of tries to then wash away the signs of his guilt. He appears not to do a bad job there, but when he looks later on in the light of day, maybe there are still these blood stains there. And that does seem to be important later on. The question of whether he can wash away the blood does seem to link back to Shakespeare's Scottish play. And can the blood be washed away from the hands and so on. There's an interesting theory that's of Dostoevsky, whose genius does seem to be sort of quite dramatic. If we say that Tolstoy tends more towards the epic in his writing, particularly in War and Peace, that Dostoevsky is perhaps closer to Greek writers of tragedy, and maybe also to Shakespeare. There is a notion that in some ways Dostoevsky's four great novels could be variations on Shakespeare's four tragedies. I mean, certainly King Lear with the three sisters, there in Brothers Karamazov, got the three brothers. Othello is quite close in some of its themes to The Idiot. It gets a bit more complicated with The Devils and Crime and Punishment to decide which is Hamlet and which is the Scottish play. Both of them have elements of both, but certainly the theme of someone committing a crime for a particular purpose and then being overcome by a guilty conscience does seem to be quite close to one of those two plays more than the other. But at the same time, there are elements of the meditation, of the meditative central hero of Hamlet is quite close to Raskolnikov as well. So I think there is some overlap there. Okay, but again, although it seems to be a big, very interesting issue, very little has actually been written about that. Okay, so he realizes he has to escape, and all of a sudden, the next unexpected stage, people are coming up to the apartment. How is he going to escape? And once again, it seems he gets sort of lucky. So, how does he get lucky on so many occasions? It does seem to be fated for him. Okay, so it's a very tense, a very, very exciting moment, particularly when the visitors realize that the key is on the latch and the door is on the latch, so therefore someone is inside. And as one of the two people says, I'm trained in being examining magistrate. Something is very odd here. She said she'd meet you at this time. There's someone there. There's no noise from either Lizaveta or Aliona. What's going on, essentially? But luckily for Raskolnikov, this guy Koch is rather impatient, so although he should stay there on guard, or maybe at some level he thinks, well, if there is a murderer behind the door, then do I really want to be standing here? So perhaps it's quite sensible that he leaves at that moment. What's the other big piece of luck that Raskolnikov gets at this moment? Then, because they've left, so he starts walking down the stairs, and then what happens? How does he actually get out? Maybe you would able to answer this question. I don't know. But, how does he make his escape? What's a good piece of luck? Precisely at the right moment, when it turns out the guys are coming back up the staircase. What happens here?
He runs into an empty room.
Yeah, empty room, and the room hadn't been empty like 2 minutes before, but these painters who were there, who will actually be an important subplot, had decided at that moment, for some reason, to have this childish fight between themselves, going out into the courtyard, punching each other, pulling their hair, and later on one of them will be thought of to be, not just the guilty person, but will be confessing to the crimes and so on. So yeah, so you get really lucky. He gets really lucky at that moment that there is this apartment that becomes empty at precisely the right moment. He's able to hide there and escape. Okay, he doesn't quite know what to do. Obviously, he's going to attract some sort of attention. Someone looks at him and says he looks drunk as a lord. because he's looking very strange. But nonetheless, he manages to escape. Okay, so then, as I said, this is a huge discrepancy, this huge tension between how he expected and how we expected almost the murder to take place. Very calculating, and the brutal, bloody reality of this really messed up crime that has happened with someone dead who was never intended to be a victim, and indeed already undermining, if you like, the whole point of his philosophy, which was, Aliona is this dreadful, cruel oppressor of people, including of her half-sister Lizaveta. She's one of the people who theoretically Raskolnikov is helping, and it turns out that she is already dead. She's dead as well. So that's certainly worth bearing in mind. Okay, so we told you he was in some sort of trance there. He manages to get rid of the X, so his mind is working to some extent at that point. Okay, so any comments on then the first part and the murder? Anything that strikes you as strange, unexpected? Something you don't understand about it? Or any general comments you want to make of this first book of Crime Punishment, which is obviously one of the great exciting murders in world literature? Yeah.
Well, when he was actually killing her, he said he kept referring to it as like an it, and like the body toppled onto the floor, and then he said like it kind of rolled over and everything, and so he wasn't even like talking about her as if she were a person, and then it was only after she was dead that he was like, oh God, I killed her. So it was like while he was murdering her, it was like only like an action that he was thinking about. He didn't like think about her as a person, and so maybe that had something to do with like how he was able to get through it, is if he like dehumanizes her.
Yeah, very good observation. So, I think that's sort of objectivization and making it into just a theory. This is a theory. This is this theory that I'm sort of doing something with now, and sort of killing this theory, and then it turns out that this is a flesh and blood person. And indeed, when Lizaveta comes along again, that just reinforces that Aliona too is a human being that who should not be killed despite all of the bad things that she does. Okay. Any other observations? Okay, we'll move on. Obviously, it's just one of the important parts of the book. What is more important is trying to understand why and what this tells us about Raskolnikov and about life and ourselves and Russia and so on and so forth. And you want to be thinking about why it is that literature so often does indeed deal with sort of crime, and particularly Dostoevsky, as we said, all of his novels are about these very serious crimes. Okay, so one of the things that is obviously significant about the way the book is constructed is that the first book of Crime and Punishment is all essentially through Raskolnikov's eyes, and now we start building up more of a picture because other people are bringing in their insights, their perspectives, and also even in book 2, the actual sort of time frame or the way the sort of time flows is very confusing. At some moments we seem to be almost in the delirium that Raskolnikov is in, and we don't know whether a day has passed, an hour has passed, or 3 days have passed. It's only afterwards that we know, okay, this is what actually happened. But I think what we're able to get is both a deeper insight into himself from within, and his already coming to understand his own nature a bit better, but also these outside perspectives, whether it's from Razumihin or the various police members, his family members, and so on and so forth. Okay, so I don't think there's too much there. What we find is that, as was mentioned before, even if the plan of the murder was, in theory, worked out so pretty carefully, the aftermath, what he would do with the money, where he would hide it, etc., that hadn't been planned at all. And just to hide these things in a hole in the wall was certainly not the best of ideas. And it's intriguing, it says on page 86, what is this? What is this? It already my punishment? That is the punishment that he feels that he's no longer as in control of things, that he isn't this of Superman, because Superman would have planned things better, or is it a different type of punishment, an even worse one that's awaiting him, the sense of guilt, the sense he's done something which has really destroyed who he is, essentially. So there are these different elements of the punishment, the isolation from humanity, and so on, which will push him towards different types of confession, different types of trying to rejoin the human family, as we've said before. Okay, so I don't think there's too much there. Of course, the fact that the police have sent him a summons is pretty scary for him at that moment. He doesn't realize that this is a false alarm. We're perhaps thinking, okay, how do they know so quickly about what's taking place? Okay, so page 89, when he says, I'm done for, if I'm done for, so be it, the fact that he's sort of so eager to be caught immediately does seem strange. And the Lord, he says, the sooner the better. And throughout this first day or so, he does seem to think, okay, it has to happen now. I have to either be caught now or confess now. So why do you think he sort of so quickly, at some times at least during this first day or so, wants to be caught, wants to confess? Why is it sort of so rapid? I mean, you can imagine it might happen after a while, but why is it sort of so immediate after the crime? Yeah.
I think Raskolnikov never really intended to go through with the murder. Like, leading up to it, he was never definitively saying, yes, I'm going to do it. And even after the murder, he almost can't believe that he did it. So he wants to be caught because he never really intended to do it in the first place. And he does feel like that's his crime and that, like, he needs to confess and, like, rejoin the human race.
Okay, good. Yeah, okay, yeah.
He even, like, when he started going down the stairs, he kind of alluded to this. He was like, if only he'd known how many more crimes he would have to commit to, like, cover it up. So maybe it's like, if he was to be caught really early on, then he wouldn't have to, like, lie and commit more crimes to, like, keep himself safe. So I think he kind of knows that, because, like, now that he's in it, he's going to have to go to some extreme measures to keep himself, like, hidden.
Okay, good, yeah. And then also, as we said, that the fact that he is sort of suffering so much that he does have a conscience that he realizes, as you say, in different places, when he tries to do something good, for example, when he gives money to Sonia or Sonia's family, and then they say to him, you're all covered in blood, he says, oh yes, and so the complete irony of this, how can I be sort of doing good? How can I be thought of as a good person, and they're sort of praying for me and thanking me when I'm a murderer, essentially? So what he believes is still most valuable about himself, as he says, he has destroyed, so he needs to somehow get into a place where he can at least partially redeem himself. At the same time, of course, there will be other places within these pages where he'll say he's acquired a new strength, and that all of this is just sort of prejudice or fears, and he's now overcoming it. So he wants to still get away with it. So there is that clash, there's that tension always. At one moment he'll be sort of trying to confess to Zamyatov, but then the next he'll draw back from that and feel quite proud that he's tricking people, and indeed in some ways given himself more of an alibi, because if he really were the murderer, would he be doing these things? And then people say, no, it's no way. Okay, we have suspicions about him, but it can't be him. So there is always a struggle going on within him. So even at the level of wanting to confess, there's also the level of wanting to get away with it as well. So both of those things are taking place. Okay, good. So, but still, part of him seems to want to get away with it in the first pages, but then he changes very quickly, wanting to confess it, it seems. So he knows he's done wrong. He's pretty sure he won't live with the guilt. He says that in pages 88, 89. So even if he believes that intellectually his plan was sound, it's as if it wasn't for him. So that goes back to your point that perhaps he never intended to go with it. He wanted to go right up to the edge and think, okay, yes, this is a good idea, but I can step back from it. And this notion of being in a trance, automation then comes into play. Okay, so page 9 says, I'll fall to my knees and tell them everything when he's going up to the police station. But I suppose it's partly the fact that he still has this arrogance within him. He doesn't like the notion of, why would I confess to these people? These people are less than I am, so why would I put myself in this humiliating position? That's something that will return at various places in the text, where he seems to want to go and confess, and then will step back from it as well. One of the things I think it's always worth pointing out, Dostoevsky is he's a very humorous writer, and I think we get this sort of great scene with the German madam there, and all of her sort of dressed up, sort of like rise up in the air like a parachute, which is what Katerina Ivanovna will say later, and her sort of very extreme perfume and so on. So in the midst of all these sort of terrible things going on, Dostoevsky has these very funny scenes, essentially. And again, that's still quite Gregorian. I suppose he does come out of the Gregorian tradition. Okay, so we won't go into all the details about the financial problems with the landlady, but it's been made pretty clear what's going on there. Okay, so Raskolnikov on page 96 seems to acquire again his sort of control, his self-esteem, where he says to the captain that he will apologize to this Lieutenant Pavlikeg, but the reason why he's in such a bad state is that he's this very poor student, and he's been suffering in all sorts of ways. He's been ill, he's trying to help his mother and so on. So he's actually trying to portray himself in the best light possible. This is not really the words of someone who then 2 seconds later will say, oh, by the way, I'm also a murderer, essentially. So he's trying to put himself in a good light there. So this is him stepping back from that instinct to confess at this moment. We'll learn about Raskolnikov had been planned to marry the landlady's daughter, but then she sort of died of typhus, and this actually is obviously quite a sort of tragic element of his backstory, and it will play a role later on when people come to judge him. Okay, so let's move on. Halfway down page 98, on the bottom of 98, had he been sentenced to the stake at this moment, even then he would not have stirred. He no longer had anything to say to these people in the local police bureau. And the most excruciating thing of all, that this was more sensational, something conscious, something intellectual. A direct sensation, the most excruciating of all sensations experienced by him hitherto in his life. So everything has changed, essentially, that he can no longer feel that he is the Raskolnikov before, no longer feel that he's a human being, that someone can sort of love and value, take pity on, because he's done this terrible thing of murdering two people. Then it turns out that everyone is talking about the murder, or the murders again, we should say, and of course for Raskolnikov this is pretty terrifying. Later on he'll say it's because he was tired, there was fresh paint in the police station, which fumes, causing him to faint, and things like that. But of course it does arouse suspicions in some of the police officers and other people, and the doctors, as Asimov. The difference being, of course, that most of them are not able to actually believe the evidence that there is something strange going on here. Whereas Porfiry Petrovich, as a great detective, realizes straight away, okay, let's put these 2 or 3 bits of evidence together, and it's quite clear psychologically that Raskolnikov is the murderer, essentially. Things like everyone else who'd pawned stuff at the pawnbroker had gone to try and reclaim them, but he didn't do that. Raskolnikov's behavior at various stages, things that he'd said that had been overheard, his hallucinations, etc., etc. It's all pretty clear. There's so much evidence, in fact, pointing at Raskolnikov. It's strange that everyone doesn't think that he's the murderer, but only Porfiry Petrovich realizes that. Okay, so I don't think we need to say too much there. Okay, so then he has to try and decide what to do with the things. The way trying to get rid of them is described as rather strange, and it seems to echo the nose, where the barbers are trying to throw the nose away and can't get rid of it. The lexical parallels are quite similar, and it's rather difficult to know exactly why that might be, but perhaps they're just coincidental. And again, throwing things into the river, of course, that could be taking us back to the nose, but it also, of course, is part of this bigger theme of water in the text. Is water, as was suggested, this purifying, positive spiritual imagery. Is it also the yellow, deadly water of Petersburg, where so many unhappy souls drown themselves, essentially. So the suicide theme and the redemption theme both come into play with the theme of the river there, or the rivers. Okay, the fact that he decides to go and hide things on the island under a bush, some people have claimed that this links back to the bush in Bronze Horseman, where the house of Yevgeny gets washed up. That might be a bit of a stretch, but it might be worth pointing out. The fact that he hides his ill-gotten gains under the stone does seem, of course, to link with the theme of Petersburg, because of Peter Petrus does mean stone, so we've said that before, so he's hiding stuff under the stone, under the Peter idea. And it's even possible that the big stone, this big block of granite that the Bronze Horseman statue was put on, that they dragged from Finland, could be, the stone's a lot smaller, of course, you can lift it up, it's 50 pounds, not 300 tons or whatever, but nonetheless it does seem to be the same type of stone. That connects him again with the Peter idea, except of course it's a complete parody of Peter's idea. Peter caused a lot of suffering, but he created the great thing of St. Petersburg. So, history will claim, well, he was justified in some ways. He may not have been justified, but that will be perhaps overall what history will say. For Raskolnikov, what is his great plan? Well, he's just stolen a few things in the purse, and he's hiding them under a stone, and not even making any use of them. The very fact that later on he'll say, okay, I didn't even count how much money was there, that already undermines his utilitarianism as a humanitarian, altruistic act, his main justification on the conscious level of why he did what he did. Because if he hasn't looked at how much money he's got, if he's not planning how he's going to use it for himself, for his family, for others, then it's really pretty clear that that wasn't such a big deal in his thinking after all, despite his attempts to convince himself otherwise. Okay, but at least he feels happy now that he's got rid of the evidence, and that is important. So, talks about this sort of crucial point, the thing you've been thinking about for the last 2 months, on page 1 of 4. to hell with new life. So it's undermining, again, this utilitarian argument, the great man argument even, that he thought that everything would change once this has happened. And that's not the case. He just feels that this is the worst moment of his life, essentially. And he just comments the thing I just mentioned. If you really did have a definite fixed aim, then why didn't you look inside the purse? And he doesn't fully process what this means, but what we, I think, understand is that, okay, there must be other reasons as well, and the text will give us those other reasons as we go through it. Of course, you'll find an excuse is because I'm ill, that's why I haven't thought about these issues, and I can't judge myself so harshly. Perhaps once I'm feeling better, I will go back to my initial plan that I did this for good motives, the greatest good of the greatest number, the utilitarian motivation. But I think he already knows that this isn't the full story. And of course he also knows he already has his great man theory because he's written the article and he's been thinking about that as well. It's just we don't know that to such an extent at this moment. Okay, so Razumihin, of course, is another of the double figures in Raskolnikov's world. The fact that they both begin with the same two letters, RNA, is probably significant in that sense. And the Russian word for the rational, for reason, is at the heart of Razumihin's name. And Raskolnikov, of course, is also someone who lays great store by rationality, but the split in him is far greater. Okay, so the idea of translation seems to be brought in various places in the text, and the idea of whether Raskolnikov's ideas are just a translation from the West does seem to be significant. Does the West represent utilitarian, materialistic, selfish, egotistical ideas, whether in Peter the Great's acts of will, or even more so in the rational egoism, utilitarianism, socialism, materialism of the 19th century. So perhaps Raskolnikov is a translation, and he can only become truly Russian again when he's taken away from Petersburg, essentially taken back to Mother Russia, essentially. So people look at him, think of him as a beggar, someone who needs their pity, and of course that's pretty humiliating for him at this moment. But it's also as if that he doesn't feel he can take money for the love of Christ, because what type of Christian charity can there be, particularly for him, once he's just committed a murder, essentially? So both the ability for him to give charity and to receive it seems to be completely destroyed by his act of murder. That won't stop him, of course, giving charity to the Marmelada family later on, but he'll see the complete absurdity of this given what he's just done. Okay, so the vision of Petersburg he then gets on page 108 seems to be this vision of this sublime, powerful Peter's creation there. His own insignificance perhaps is also implied by that when he looks out at this marvelous vista, that he's done that in the past at various points, when his idea of, I too want to be a great person, I too want to be, if not Peter the Great, but at least someone who matters, essentially. So those were the things that had influenced him in the early stages of his theorizing. And could he take the same interest in the same old subjects and scenes that interested him before? Can he get any joy in life after what he's done, essentially? Can he look out at this wonderful view of St. Petersburg and think, yes, that's beautiful? Or will he just see the murdered pawnbroker and Lizaveta? So he feels he's taken a pair of scissors and cut himself off from everyone and everything there and then. So maybe this play on the scissors or the knife that's cutting the bloody strands away from his trousers and so on and so forth. Whether the image of the cutting blade, again, takes us back to the axe, that might be a stretch. But remember that one of the symbols of what Peter did to create Petersburg was to cut a window through to Europe, so probably it's like no in the Russian, which means basically to hew, probably with an axe, a big window. So Peter's creation was a great act of violence, essentially, on a nationwide scale. Is Raskolnikov trying to do that in his life? I think people mentioned before this sort of strange dream that Raskolnikov has, where it's Ilya Petrovich beating the landlady, and this is a transformation, of course, of the murder that he's just committed there. Okay, so let's continue then on whatever the next day is.